Villa del Prado, Madrid Mountains, 4:30 p.m. Diego Herrera, 42, pharmaceutical industry magnate, returns home earlier than expected and hears laughter coming from the living room. He approaches silently, and what he sees takes his breath away. His daughter Carmen, 4 years old, whom doctors had declared permanently unable to walk, is taking her first tentative steps toward the outstretched arms of Elena Morales, 28, the nanny hired just 2 weeks before. Diego freezes behind the door as his daughter, considered a lost cause by Europe's finest neurologists, laughs and walks as if it were the most natural thing in the world. What he would discover about Elena and her revolutionary methods would forever change his vision of medicine, love, and miracles. The autumn wind whispered through the ancient oak trees surrounding Villa del Prado as Diego's hands trembled against the doorframe. The sound of his daughter's laughter, pure, crystalline, impossible, echoed through the marble corridors like a symphony he'd thought he'd never hear again. Not since Isabel's death had these walls witnessed such joy. Villa del Prado stood majestically in the Madrid mountains like a jewel of Spanish Renaissance architecture, surrounded by gardens that seemed painted by a Golden Age master. Diego Herrera had acquired this historic mansion after his pharmaceutical company became one of Europe's most influential, transforming it into a refuge where modern luxury merged with past elegance. The property sprawled across 15 acres of meticulously manicured grounds, featuring a private chapel, an indoor pool with a retractable glass ceiling, and a library housing over 10,000 volumes on medicine and science. But within those golden walls lay a tragedy that no patrimony could cure. The irony wasn't lost on Diego. He'd built an empire creating hope in the form of revolutionary drugs, yet he remained completely powerless before his daughter's condition. Carmen was 4 years old and had never walked. Born premature due to complications that also took the life of her mother Isabel during an emergency cesarean at 7 months, the little girl had been declared by the world's best neurologists as affected by severe cerebral palsy that would forever compromise her mobility. The medical verdicts had been merciless, delivered in sterile offices filled with diplomas and awards that seemed to mock Diego's desperation. "The neural pathways are simply not there, Mr. Herrera," Dr. Castellanos, Madrid's most renowned pediatric neurologist, had explained with clinical detachment. "The brain scans show extensive damage to the motor cortex. She'll never walk. It's better to accept reality and focus on what she can do within her limitations." Diego had consulted the finest specialists from Madrid to Zurich, funded experimental research, and transformed an entire wing of the villa into a private clinic equipped with the world's most advanced technologies. Physical therapy machines worth hundreds of thousands of euros sat gathering dust, their promises as empty as the hope in Diego's heart. Nothing had worked. Nothing had even come close. Carmen was a child of vivid intelligence and infectious smile, with long chestnut hair and green eyes that sparkled with curiosity despite her body's limitations. She had learned to move skillfully with her customized wheelchair, painted pink with butterfly decorations. But Diego saw in her eyes the question she never dared ask. "Why can't I run like other children?" The question haunted him during sleepless nights when he wandered the villa's empty corridors, past portraits of Isabel that seemed to judge his failures as both a husband and father. He'd saved his wife's company but couldn't save his wife. He could cure rare diseases with his medications but couldn't help the only person who truly mattered. The nannies had succeeded each other in the villa like changing seasons. Some had been excellent but cold professionals who treated Carmen like a medical case study. Others were warm-hearted but unprepared to face the specific needs of a disabled child. All, however, had accepted the medical verdict as an immutable fact, concentrating on daily care rather than the possibility of improvement. Diego himself had eventually surrendered. His days were divided between business meetings where he decided the fate of millions of patients worldwide, and afternoons at home where he felt like the most failed father on earth. The contradiction ate at him daily. His medicines gave others hope while his own child remained trapped in her condition. It was a Friday in September when Elite Domestics Agency proposed Elena Morales. 28 years old, licensed in physiotherapy with pediatric specialization, impeccable references from Madrid's finest families, specific experience with special needs children. The agency director, Senora Vasquez, had been unusually enthusiastic about Elena's qualifications, though she'd been vague about her previous positions. "She's different, Mr. Herrera," Senora Vasquez had said, her eyes holding an unusual intensity. The families she's worked with speak of her with something approaching reverence. I can't explain it, but there's something special about her approach. Diego accepted the interview more out of duty than hope. He needed someone to care for Carmen while he traveled for work, someone who wouldn't look at his daughter with pity or false optimism. Elena arrived on a Sunday morning with a small suitcase and a smile that illuminated her entire face. She was a woman of medium height, blonde hair tied in a neat ponytail, dressed simply with natural elegance. What immediately struck Diego were her blue eyes, deep, full of a determination he'd never seen in other nannies. They seemed to hold secrets, as if she could see possibilities where others saw only limitations. When Elena explained her work philosophy, Diego thought she was too idealistic to be effective. She spoke of hidden potential, mind-body connection, miracles born from patience. Her words seemed those of a visionary rather than a serious professional, but there was something in her voice, a quiet confidence that suggested she'd witnessed impossible things before. I believe every child carries within them the seeds of their own miracle, Mr. Herrera, Elena had said, her gaze never wavering from his. Sometimes those seeds just need the right conditions to grow. Diego had nearly ended the interview right then, dismissing such talk as New Age nonsense. But something made him pause, perhaps the way Elena's eyes had briefly glanced toward Carmen's room upstairs, as if she could already sense the child's presence. Carmen adored Elena instantly. The little girl, normally shy with strangers, began chatting with Elena as if she'd known her all her life. She showed her collection of dolls, the drawings hanging in her room, told her about her favorite stories. Elena listened with total attention, asked genuine questions, laughed at Carmen's antics with sincerity that moved the heart. Elena, do you think butterflies dream about flying? Carmen had asked during that first meeting, a question that had stumped previous nannies. I think they dream about dancing in the sky, Elena had replied without hesitation. And I think little girls can learn to dance too, in their own special way. Diego hired Elena that very night, more because of the effect she'd had on Carmen than from conviction about her unconventional methods. He didn't know he was about to witness the greatest miracle of his life. 2 weeks had passed since Elena's arrival, and Diego had noticed subtle but significant changes in Carmen. The child was more lively, laughed more often, had acquired a confidence she'd never had before. Her appetite had improved, her sleep was more peaceful, and she'd begun asking questions about the world with renewed curiosity. What Diego didn't know was that Elena was working with his daughter using methods that went far beyond simple assistance. Each morning, Elena transformed Carmen's playroom into a movement laboratory. She never called what they did together exercises. They were magical games. Carmen, seated on a soft carpet, learned to make her legs fly like butterflies, to swim in the air with movements that stimulated dormant neural connections. Elena had introduced concepts of visualization, encouraging Carmen to imagine her legs as separate entities that could learn and grow stronger through stories and play. Today, your right leg is a brave princess who wants to learn how to dance, Elena would say, gently manipulating Carmen's limb while telling elaborate tales. She's been sleeping for a long time, but she's ready to wake up and join the adventure. Diego, when present, observed these games with skepticism. The doctors had clearly explained that Carmen's neurological damage was permanent, that certain brain connections were compromised forever. Seeing Elena encourage his daughter to move her legs seemed almost cruel, like feeding false hopes. Yet he couldn't deny that Carmen was happy, happier than she'd been since Isabel's death. The child eagerly awaited the hour of magical games with Elena. She laughed during sessions, had begun dreaming aloud about when she would run through the garden. Diego found himself torn between wanting to stop these illusions and the joy of seeing his daughter so full of life. Elena had also introduced a completely new routine. Instead of simply pushing Carmen's wheelchair, she encouraged the child to use her arm muscles to move autonomously. She'd transformed movements through the house into adventures, and Carmen propelled herself enthusiastically toward each destination. The muscles in her arms had visibly strengthened, and with them, her self-esteem. "Look, Papa," Carmen would call out, racing her wheelchair down the villa's long corridors. "I'm faster than the wind." The evenings were dedicated to foot theater. Elena had invented stories where Carmen's feet were characters who needed to learn to dance. The child, lying in bed, would move her toes following Elena's stories, laughing when the character feet did funny things. Diego had heard the neurologist say those movements were just meaningless reflexes, but Elena maintained that every small voluntary movement was a brick in the construction of a miracle. She kept detailed notes, tracking every tiny progression, every moment when Carmen's responses seemed more deliberate than reflexive. One night, while dining alone in the grand dining room, Diego heard prolonged laughter coming from upstairs. He climbed silently and stopped in front of Carmen's bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. Elena was sitting on the floor, legs crossed, telling a story and animating characters with different voices. Carmen was lying on her stomach, propped on her elbows, following the tale with wide eyes of admiration. But what made Diego startle was seeing Carmen rhythmically moving her legs, as if she were walking while lying down. Elena made no comments about the movements. She incorporated them naturally into the story. The princess moved her legs that way because she was running through the magical meadow, chasing fireflies that held the secrets of the kingdom. Diego moved away, confused and stirred by something he couldn't name. The doctors had said those movements were just involuntary spasms, but something in Elena's attitude made him think she saw something others had overlooked. There was a method to her madness, a purpose behind every story, every game, every gentle touch. Friday of the second week, Diego had to travel to Brussels for a meeting with the European Commission about his new experimental drugs. It was a crucial appointment that could be worth hundreds of millions of euros. His company's breakthrough treatment for a rare childhood genetic disorder hung in the balance. For the first time in his career, he hesitated to leave home, unable to define why, but with the feeling he was about to miss something important. The Brussels meeting was magnificent. The Commission approved 3 of his new medications for treating rare diseases, guaranteeing his company enormous profits, and above all, the possibility of helping thousands of patients across Europe. It should have been the happiest day of his business career, the culmination of 15 years of research and development. However, all he wanted was to return home. Throughout the presentation, his mind kept drifting to Carmen and Elena, to the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through Villa del Prado's halls. He found himself checking his watch obsessively, calculating time zones, imagining what magical games might be happening in his absence. The plane landed at Madrid Barajas 2 hours ahead of schedule due to favorable winds. Diego decided not to notify Elena of his early return. He wanted to surprise Carmen, perhaps catch one of their magical game sessions in progress. Driving through the Madrid mountains toward Villa del Prado, he felt strangely emotional, as if he were about to discover something that would change everything. He had no idea how right he was. The landscape rushed past his window. Rolling hills dotted with ancient olive groves, small villages with red-tiled roofs, the mountains standing like silent guardians over the valley. This was the route he'd driven countless times since acquiring the villa, but today it felt different. Charged with anticipation he couldn't explain. It was 4:30 p.m. when Diego silently opened the main door of Villa del Prado. Autumn sunlight filtered through the great windows, creating light games on the ancient marble floors. The house was immersed in serene tranquility, but what he heard made him stop cold. Laughter, genuine, joyful laughter that he hadn't heard since Isabel had died. The sound seemed to dance through the air, lifting his spirits in a way he'd almost forgotten was possible. The voices came from the great living room, transformed into a play area for Carmen. Diego approached on tiptoe and stopped behind the half-open door. What he saw paralyzed him completely. Elena stood in the center of the room, arms extended forward with a radiant smile. 2 meters away from her, Carmen was standing up, her small hands pressed against the floor, the muscles in her legs, those legs declared without motor function, visibly contracted to support her. Time seemed suspended. Diego's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched his daughter, his supposedly incurably paralyzed daughter, push herself upright with determination he'd never seen before. Carmen's face was flushed with concentration and joy, her green eyes sparkling with an inner light that seemed to illuminate the entire room. Carmen took a tentative step forward, then another. Her feet touched the ground with growing decision while she laughed with that crystalline laugh that was the most beautiful sound in the world. She was walking, actually walking, step by step, approaching Elena's outstretched arms. "That's it, princess," Elena encouraged, her voice thick with emotion. "Your legs remembered their dance. They've been practicing in their dreams." Diego felt his knees give way. His daughter, subjected to every type of medical test, was standing alone. Her legs, defined as neurologically compromised, were supporting her. When she reached Elena and threw herself into her arms, both exploded in liberating laughter that filled the entire villa. Elena lifted her and spun her in the air, while Carmen screamed with joy. "I'm flying, Elena! I'm really flying!" "You've always been able to fly, little one," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You just needed to remember how." Diego leaned against the wall, tears coursing down his cheeks. What he'd witnessed defied everything he believed he knew about medicine, about the limits of the human body. His daughter had walked. They hadn't been perfect steps, but they'd been real, voluntary, impossible steps according to every medical diagnosis. The scientific part of his mind raced through explanations: misdiagnosis, delayed neural development, spontaneous recovery. But his father's heart knew he'd witnessed something beyond conventional understanding. This wasn't medical science as he knew it. This was something far more profound. Carmen spotted her father, and her face lit up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. She freed herself from Elena's arms, stood unsteadily, and began walking toward him. Each step was a revolution against everything he'd been told was possible. Diego knelt and opened his arms, hardly daring to breathe. When Carmen threw herself into his embrace, he held her as if he never wanted to let her go. He cried without control, while his daughter whispered in his ear that Elena had said, "Feet can learn to walk if you tell them the right stories." "Papa, did you see? Did you see me dancing with my legs?" Carmen's voice was breathless with excitement. "Elena says I've been practicing in my dreams, and today my dreams came true." Diego raised his gaze to Elena, who watched them with tears in her eyes but also with concern. She knew that what he'd witnessed raised questions that went far beyond traditional medicine. Her secret was out, and with it came complications she'd hoped to avoid a little longer. That night, after putting Carmen to bed, she couldn't stop recounting her magical adventure to every stuffed animal in her room. Diego and Elena sat in the great living room. The fireplace crackled softly, while outside Madrid glittered with thousands of lights. Diego had opened a bottle of his finest Ribera del Duero, but neither had touched their glass. The silence was charged with unspoken questions. Diego looked at Elena as if seeing her for the first time, trying to reconcile the image of the gentle nanny with that of the woman who had performed a medical miracle. "You're not just a nanny, are you?" Diego finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena broke the silence by explaining that what he'd seen wasn't magic, but the result of weeks of work based on scientific principles that traditional medicine often overlooked. Infant neuroplasticity was much more powerful than neurologists were willing to admit. As Elena spoke, Diego discovered her true story, and it was far more extraordinary than he'd imagined. Elena Morales wasn't simply a nanny. She held a doctorate in neuroscience from Cambridge University, where she'd graduated summa cum laude with a dissertation on neural pathway reconstruction in pediatric patients. She'd worked at an experimental clinic in Zurich, specializing in impossible cases of infant cerebral palsy. Her methods had achieved results that defied all medical expectations, with success rates that made her colleagues uncomfortable. Traditional medicine, Elena explained, her voice gaining strength as she shared her passion, treats the brain like a fixed machine, but the infant brain is more like clay, malleable, adaptive, capable of forming new pathways when given the right stimulation and environment. Elena had abandoned her academic career after a personal tragedy. Her younger brother Mateo, paralyzed in a traffic accident at 16, had regained the ability to walk thanks to her revolutionary methods. But when she'd attempted to publish her results, the medical community had rejected them, claiming her documentation was insufficient and her methods unscientific. They couldn't accept that something so simple could work where their expensive treatments had failed, Elena said, her voice tinged with old pain. A rehabilitation program based on storytelling, imagination, and emotional connection. It threatened everything they'd built their careers on. The medical establishment had marginalized her from the academic world after a campaign of professional sabotage led by Dr. Heinrich Strauss, a prominent neurologist whose reputation had been built on declaring cases hopeless. Her research grants were revoked, her papers rejected, her career systematically dismantled. Elena had decided to work as a specialized nanny, privately helping families with children considered lost causes. Carmen was her 7th small patient. The previous 6 had all shown significant improvements, some walking again, others regaining speech, all exceeding their doctor's most optimistic projections. Diego remained silent, absorbing revelations that questioned everything he believed. He, who had built a pharmaceutical empire on traditional science, found himself faced with evidence that more effective approaches existed than his costly treatments. "Why didn't you reveal your identity immediately?" Diego asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Elena explained that experience had taught her wealthy parents often preferred prestigious diagnoses to hopes offered by a woman working outside the official system. The medical establishment had made her a pariah, but that had freed her to help children without the constraints of institutional politics. "When I work within the system," Elena said, "I have to follow protocols that often harm more than they help. Out here, I can focus solely on what the child needs, not what the insurance companies will approve." Diego understood why she'd been marginalized. In the modern medical world, an approach that worked without generating enormous profits was dangerous. Her methods cost almost nothing: time, patience, love, and scientific competence. No expensive equipment, no patented drugs, no long-term dependencies on medical institutions. That night, Diego walked for hours through the villa's corridors, thinking about Carmen sleeping after performing her miracle, about Elena, who had sacrificed a brilliant career to help children, about himself and his role in a system that perhaps failed those who needed help most. By morning, he'd made the most important decision of his life. The months following that nocturnal revelation radically changed life at Villa del Prado. Diego transformed the entire East Wing into a private experimental clinic, equipping it with the finest neuromotor rehabilitation technologies. But the real revolution was the completely new approach Elena had brought. Carmen continued improving day by day. Her steps became more confident. She ran through the villa's corridors, jumped on the living room sofas, danced in the garden under Diego's moved gaze, who still found it hard to believe the transformation. But more than her physical progress, it was Carmen's emotional transformation that astounded everyone who knew her. The quiet, resigned child had become a radiant little girl full of confidence and dreams. She spoke constantly about becoming a dancer, about teaching other children to walk, about the magical stories that had awakened her legs. Diego had begun secretly funding Elena's research, transforming part of his company's laboratories into centers for studying infant neuroplasticity. He recruited the world's finest neuroscientists, offering them unprecedented research budgets to investigate Elena's methods with scientific rigor. The first external case arrived through word of mouth. Maria Benitez, wife of a famous surgeon at Ramon y Cajal Hospital, had heard rumors about the miracles at Villa del Prado. Her son Francisco, 7 years old, was quadriplegic after a pool accident that had left him underwater for nearly 4 minutes. Dr. Benitez had been skeptical, even hostile, when his wife first mentioned Elena. "These miracle workers prey on desperate parents," he'd warned. "They offer false hope and take your money." But Maria was desperate. Francisco had been her world before the accident, a brilliant athletic boy who'd dreamed of becoming a professional footballer. Now he lay motionless, able only to move his eyes and speak in whispers. Elena accepted helping Francisco under strict conditions: total confidentiality and no external medical interference. She would work with the boy for 6 months, and if no progress was made, she would step aside with no payment required. Diego observed Elena work with Francisco exactly as she had with Carmen. The same magical stories, the same patient encouragement, the same unwavering belief that the boy's body could remember how to move. After 2 months, Francisco moved his fingers. After 4 months, he sat alone. After 6 months, his parents wept watching him take his first steps. Dr. Benitez, who had once mocked Elena's methods, became one of her most vocal advocates in Madrid's medical community. News began filtering through Madrid's medical circles. Diego received accusatory calls from university professors and business colleagues who claimed he was damaging the reputation of legitimate medicine. But he also received desperate calls from parents across Europe who refused to accept medical verdicts condemning their children to permanent disability. The decision came one spring afternoon while dining in the garden with Carmen and Elena. Carmen recounted how she'd run with classmates at school, how she was the fastest in her class, how her teacher had asked if she'd like to join the school's dance team. Diego looked at his daughter, who a year earlier had been confined to a wheelchair, and understood he couldn't keep the miracle to himself. The next day, he convened a historic press conference. Before journalists, doctors, and dozens of parents with disabled children, he announced the founding of the Herrera Center for Infant Neuroplasticity. He presented Carmen and Francisco's cases, showed videos of their transformations, illustrated the scientific bases supported by his laboratories. Above all, he announced he would donate half his fortune to make the therapies free for any family, regardless of their economic situation. The reaction was explosive. Medical colleagues accused him of betraying serious science. Specialized journals published editorials against false hopes. The Spanish Medical Association launched an investigation into his unethical practices. But thousands of parents from around the world began calling, arriving with their incurable children. Elena, from reserved nanny, found herself at the center of an international debate dividing the medical world. Dr. Strauss, the German neurologist who had orchestrated Elena's academic downfall, flew to Madrid to personally discredit her work. He arrived with a team of specialists, prepared to expose what he termed a dangerous charade. Instead, after spending a week observing Elena's methods and examining her patients, Dr. Strauss did something that shocked the international medical community. He publicly apologized to Elena and requested permission to study under her guidance. "I've spent 30 years telling parents their children would never recover," he announced at a conference in Berlin. "I was wrong. Elena Morales has shown us that the brain's capacity for healing far exceeds anything we previously understood. But Elena only cared about one thing: the children who continued improving, demonstrating daily that miracles are the result of love, science, and the conviction that no case is lost." 5 years had passed since that press conference that shocked the international medical world. The Herrera Center for Infant Neuroplasticity had become a global reference with locations in 12 countries and a waiting list of thousands of families from every continent. Carmen, now 9 years old, had become the living symbol of what determination and love could achieve. She not only walked perfectly, but had begun practicing classical ballet, fulfilling the dream she'd cultivated since childhood. Her videos, published on the center's social media, had gone viral worldwide, inspiring millions never to give up when facing difficulties. Diego had completely transformed his pharmaceutical company. Instead of focusing exclusively on profits, he'd redirected much of his research toward developing innovative therapies for childhood disabilities. His laboratories worked closely with Elena's team to develop standardized protocols that could be applied worldwide. Elena had become the center's scientific director and one of the world's most recognized pediatric neuroscientists. She'd published 3 books on her methods, given lectures at the most prestigious universities, trained hundreds of therapists in her revolutionary approaches. But what filled her with the most pride were the 847 children who, thanks to her methods, had recovered motor functions that traditional medicine considered lost forever. The center's success had attracted attention from international institutions. The World Health Organization had commissioned a study of Elena's methods, and the results had been so convincing that WHO had recommended integrating her techniques into standard pediatric rehabilitation protocols. But the true revolution was cultural. The Herrera Center had demonstrated that an approach based on love, patience, and the conviction that every child deserved a chance could achieve better results than expensive, impersonal therapies. Thousands of therapists worldwide had begun applying Elena's principles, transforming how society viewed childhood disabilities. Medical schools had started incorporating her methodologies into their curricula, despite initial resistance from traditional educators. Diego and Elena had also found love. 2 years earlier, they'd married in an intimate ceremony in Villa del Prado's garden, with Carmen as maid of honor. Their marriage had grown naturally from sharing a common mission, mutual respect, and awareness of having witnessed a miracle that had changed their lives. They'd had a son, Marco, now 1 year old, whom Carmen adored as a precious little brother. Watching Carmen play with Marco, run after him when he began crawling, carry him when he cried, was daily proof for Diego that miracles truly exist and sometimes arrive through people you least expect. Carmen had also become an advocate for other children with disabilities. At 9, she spoke at conferences, visited hospitals, and had started a foundation to provide Elena's therapeutic methods to families who couldn't afford them. Her maturity and compassion amazed everyone who met her. "I want every child to know their legs can remember how to dance," Carmen would tell audiences of doctors and parents. "You just have to tell them the right stories and believe with all your heart." One summer afternoon, while the family dined on Villa del Prado's terrace, overlooking the Madrid mountains tinted pink in the sunset, Carmen asked a question that made everyone smile: if they remembered when she didn't know how to walk. Elena took Carmen's hand and explained that it wasn't important to remember when she couldn't walk, but to celebrate everything she'd learned to do since then. Diego, lifting Marco, who laughed happily, added that every child has within them the capacity to perform miracles. They just need someone who believes in them enough to help them discover it. That night, as they put the children to bed and sat in their favorite living room contemplating stars through the great window, Diego and Elena knew they'd created something that went far beyond their family. They demonstrated to the world that true love isn't just what you feel, but what you transform into concrete action to change others' lives. The girl who would never walk now ran free through the world, carrying the message that no dream is too big when you have the courage to believe in miracles and the determination to make them reality. The Herrera Center continued growing, helping more children, training more therapists, changing more lives. But for Diego, Elena, and Carmen, the greatest miracle remained the daily one. Waking each morning knowing that love can truly move mountains, and sometimes those mountains are called impossible. As the story of Villa del Prado spread across the globe, it became more than just a tale of medical breakthrough. It became a testament to the power of refusing to accept limitations, of seeing possibility where others see only despair, and of understanding that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from machines or medicines, but from the simple revolutionary act of believing in the possible. And in a world often divided by skepticism and cynicism, the laughter of a little girl who learned to dance when doctors said she'd never walk became a symphony of hope that echoed far beyond the mountains of Madrid, reaching every parent who'd ever been told their child's condition was hopeless, every dreamer who'd been told to be realistic, and every heart that had dared to believe that love, combined with science and unwavering faith, could indeed work miracles.